Chills. Number 6. The Bloody Car. Judith Himes was only 22 years old when she discovered that she was pregnant. Since having a child out of wedlock was a social taboo in 1965, the Florida resident secretly arranged to have an illegal abortion. On the day of her scheduled appointment, Judith left as planned, only to never return home. 3 weeks later, a rental car in her name was found hundreds of miles away in Atlanta, Georgia. Bloodstains were in the back seat, but Judith was nowhere to be found. The only possible lead was a man in his 30s who had been seen parking the vehicle and exiting with a duffel bag. Police suspected this man to be jdgehlert, who was arrested months later for impersonating a physician, but who was never properly questioned after posting bail and skipping town. The case went cold for 25 years until a Florida police officer named Chuck Scherer received a strange phone call one day from someone claiming to be a radio talk show host from Omaha, Nebraska. The radio host said they had information about Judith Himes from an anonymous call-in, but when Scherer called the station the next day to verify, no one had any idea what he was referring to. Whoever had been talking to Scherer that day had to be an imposter. 2 days later, Scherer received a phone call saying that Judith was alive in Omaha. Shortly thereafter, Scherer received a third phone call, this time from someone who was apparently living in Hungary, claiming to have recently spent time in the country with jdgehlert, the fake doctor who was on the run. The FBI traced the phone call and verified it was indeed from Budapest, Hungary, but they were unable to verify that the caller had been associating with jdgehlert. Strangest of all, however, is how Scherer himself had just returned from a trip to Omaha, Nebraska when he had begun receiving these calls. During his stay, Scherer did not mention the Himes case to a single person. After all, why would he mention a cold case that's decades old? So why did he receive 3 phone calls about the case upon returning, 2 of which were leads from Omaha? Some say that Judith was living in Omaha and wanted to throw off the trail. But how would she know of Scherer's trip? And why would she think he was a threat to her discovery? No one knows. The case was officially closed after an anonymous letter was sent to the police station explaining that Judith had died in the rental car during the abortion. But the 3 mystery calls had never been solved. Number 5. Who killed Julia Wallace? William Herbert Wallace was a meek and mild-mannered insurance agent who lived in Liverpool, England in 1931. He went to play chess at a local cafe one particular evening, as was his usual routine. Upon arrival, however, an employee had a strange and cryptic message to give. According to the cafe worker, someone identifying themselves as R.M. Qualtrough had called and left instructions for Wallace to travel to 25 Menlove Gardens East, where he was to return their phone call. Wallace figured this was simply an overly discreet client who wanted to speak with him about insurance matters and prepared himself for a short business trip. The next day, according to what Wallace later told police detectives, he allegedly headed to Menlove Gardens East as per the caller's instructions. However, while there was in fact a Menlove's Garden North, a Menlove Gardens South, and a Menlove Gardens West, Wallace was surprised to learn that there was no such place as Menlove Gardens East. The mysterious caller had given him a fictional address. When Wallace returned home, he was shocked to find his wife, Julia Wallace, had been savagely beaten to death by an intruder. Investigators were able to trace the mysterious call to a phone booth that was a mere 400 yards away from Wallace's house, and also in close proximity to a local tramway station that he would have had to use in order to get to Menlove Gardens. The police suspected that Wallace had called the cafe himself and left the message as an alibi before murdering his wife and catching a tram ride across town. A jury agreed, and Wallace was sentenced to death for murder. Wallace appealed the verdict, however, and a second look at the evidence revealed that there was no possible way that Wallace could have been responsible for the murder. A milkman had seen Julia Wallace alive at 6:45 p.m., meaning that Wallace, a heavy smoker in his 50s with a kidney disease, would had to have staged a break-in, beaten his wife to death, and cleaned himself up in less than 5 minutes in order to make it to the station on time. Wallace was freed from prison, but his life would never be the same, all thanks to one phone call that was either an attempt to keep Wallace away from his wife during her murder, or simply a bad-timed prank. Number 4. Caller predicts exact time of JFK's death. In 1963, two switchboard operators in California overheard a strange and mysterious 15-minute phone call that has been the center of countless government investigations ever since. Doris Bliss was working the switchboards when one phone line in particular caught her attention due to a fuzzy sound. She received no reply after identifying herself as an operator, and after hearing strange whispers, Doris got her supervisor, Gene Shores, to listen with her, now fearful that the caller might have been having an emergency. According to FBI reports, the caller dialed a series of numbers and then faintly whispered, "The president is gonna die at 10:10, which was approximately 2 minutes away. The voice also spoke of how there's gonna be fire in all of the windows of the Justice and the Supreme Court, before going on to say that the government is going up in flames. After the caller dialed another long string of numbers, Jean asked if she could be of service, at which point a middle-aged woman calmly replied, "Please get off the line, I'm using the phone," in a matter-of-fact tone. The conversation went back to more erratic whispering, and the caller slightly changed their prediction, now saying that the president is gonna die at 10:30. While this call was happening, President Kennedy was unknowingly traveling towards his infamous death at the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald. His assassination occurred precisely at 10:30 Pacific Daylight Time, which just so happened to coincide with the California time zone where the call had originated from. Even more eerie, JFK's motorcade was originally supposed to arrive at 10 o'clock Pacific Daylight Time, but experienced travel delays. This was right around the time that the mysterious caller adjusted her prediction of the president's demise to 10:30. Number 3. The disappearance of Brandon Swanson. No one knows whatever happened to Brandon Swanson, not even his parents, who were the last people to ever speak with him over the phone. In 2008, the 19-year-old Minnesota college student became stranded after crashing into a ditch on the side of a gravel country road. He called his parents and asked for them to pick him up, but they had trouble finding his exact location. After 45 minutes of searching for him, the conversation took a very dark turn. The college student grew impatient and told his parents that he was going to take a shortcut through a farmer's field to meet them. It was a full moon that night. Brandon screamed a 4-letter curse word to his father, and the line abruptly went dead.
The minute that that call dropped, I just became sick. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was very, very bad, and could hardly fathom, what was happening at that point.
It was the last anyone had ever heard from Brandon again. Brandon's car was found by police the next day, but no traces of the young man were ever discovered. The rural scene was unexplainably devoid of any evidence. No foul play was suspected. In fact, the forensic teams couldn't even tell which direction he would have headed off in the night before. Over 500 volunteers and dozens of bloodhounds could not determine what happened, despite covering 120 miles in 120 days. Police reasoned that Brandon most likely fell into a nearby river and drowned. His parents, however, have a different story. When they tried to call him back, they claimed the phone rang and rang. If Brandon went underwater, they argue, then the phone should not have continued to ring for hours when called. Brandon's mother even claims that one of the bloodhounds followed a scent trail from the car down a stretch of road to the abandoned farm. According to her, the dog actually jumped in the river, jumped back out, worked the trail to another gravel road, and then lost the scent. Whatever happened to Brandon on that fateful night, his remains were never found, and whatever cut his phone call short on that night was never revealed. Number 2. Harassing phone call sent a man to the mental ward. Bashir Kojaji worked at a trendy DC restaurant called Marrakesh, which served Moroccan cuisine. Starting in 1983, Bashir began to receive a barrage of mysterious phone calls that were so extreme, they would eventually place him in the mental hospital. Every day, a mysterious caller going by the moniker of L'Enfant would threaten the staff of Marrakesh with death, scream obscenities at the top of their lungs, and go on long abusive triads that would make little sense. The calls would begin as soon as Bashir stepped in the restaurant and would continue every hour. Sometimes the caller would imitate a young girl, an African American child, or even an adult with a variety of thick Middle Eastern accents. Even though the Marrakesh's owner was Bashir's niece and not Bashir himself, the restaurant still continued to get harassing phone calls for nearly a decade, long after Bashir had stopped working there. Eventually, the phone harassment escalated to physical intimidation. Bashir's Mercedes-Benz was vandalized and the son of his close friend was ambushed and severely beaten. His pregnant girlfriend began receiving death threats as well. When Bashir traveled to Philadelphia to visit his sister and escape the harassment, the relentless phone calls somehow followed him. At this point, he was suffering from a lack of sleep, suffering from nightmares, and constantly fearing for his life. Even after he committed himself to a psychiatric care facility, the Marrakesh restaurant continued to be the target of organized phone harassment for quite some time. The FBI soon investigated, and a phone trace revealed that the harassing phone calls were coming from payphones that were geographically far apart. Basically, Bashir was the target of a calculated gang of stalkers who were apparently trying to drive him mad. But who could they have been? There are a couple explanations. In 1974, Bashir was kidnapped while in Beirut and tortured for 5 days until he made a grisly suicide attempt, which forced his captors to drop him off at a hospital. Exactly which faction his captors belonged to remains unknown. Bashir, however, claims that they had belonged to a terrorist group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO for short. According to Bashir, the PLO have mistaken him for a CIA informant and have been devoted to driving him completely insane ever since. An article in the Washington Post, however, suggests another possibility. For years, Bashir had been purchasing advertising space in the Washington Times and the Washington Post to run bizarre anti-Arabic messages. This apparently is in response to his kidnapping. These ads, which Bashir calls therapeutic, accuse Jewish people of corrupting Arab families, promoting homosexuality, and other strange claims. At the bottom of the ad reads the same line, sponsored by the Marrakesh Enterprises. It also specifically lists the address of the Marrakesh restaurant, along with its phone number. No one can say for sure if Bashir was actually being stalked by a terrorist organization since the 1970s, or if the phone calls were a result of his anti-Arabic advertisements. Either way, the true identity of Lee Enfant, the man who drove Bashir insane, has never been identified. Number 1. The Washington Gang Stalking. The Kendall family is just like any other Washington household, except for one major difference. They were the victims of a perpetual and relentless campaign of cell phone harassment that stretched on seemingly forever. It all started when 16-year-old Courtney's cellular phone began sending threatening text messages to her friends on its own. After that, a caller with a raspy voice began to threaten the lives of their pets and warned that all family members would one day have their throats slit.
You are so dead. I will kill you. We are going to start coming every night. You just might not know when. We're looking at you.
The incessant calls soon began to escalate, describing every move that the Kendalls made in real time, from what they were doing to what they were wearing. One conversation even told the Kendalls' mother that they preferred lemons when she was cutting limes in the kitchen. After filing a report, the family was warned never to contact the police again. The caller would even sometimes play back private conversations that they had managed to somehow record without the poor family knowing, including a conversation they had with a local detective. After receiving enough anonymous threats and intimidation, the family reached their breaking point and installed a new security system in their home. Shortly after doing so, however, the mother received a voicemail stating that they already knew what the new security code was and that the family was not safe. Likewise, efforts to switch phone companies were fruitless. The new phone number was always compromised within a day. Perhaps the most disturbing aspects of this story is how their harasser or harassers somehow seemed to be taking control of the very phone itself. It was not uncommon for the family's phones to turn themselves off and on out of nowhere, and for certain settings such as the ringtone to have been changed on their own. When the police tried to trace the source of these calls, The trace number always came back to the Kuykendall's own phones, even if they were turned off at the time of the call. Security experts suggest that a hacker may have infiltrated the cell phone company's website, where they could have remotely exploited cell phone features such as GPS tracking and voicemail from afar. Even if this was true, however, the person responsible, along with the reason why someone would relentlessly target a seemingly innocent family, remains a disturbing mystery to this day.